All right, welcome everybody to the Joint Committee on Coastal Flooding and Adaptation. This is our final meeting of the year, obviously, and we may have another one in January, but we'll talk about that a little later on our. Sean, how about calling the roll?
Delegate Keene.
Present.
Delegate Askew.
Present.
Delegate Hodges.
Here.
Delegate Ranson. Senator Kiggins.
Here.
Senator Locke. Andrea McClellan.
Here.
Chris Stone.
Here.
Joseph Bouchard. Vice Chair Converse Fowler. Here. Chair Lewis.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
All right, great. So we won't waste any time. We're getting a little late start. We anticipate Senator Locke may be able to join us virtually in a little while, but we have a quorum in case we want to do anything when we get down to legislative recommendations later on the agenda. But we've got a little bit of a lengthy agenda, and I expect some discussion too when we get to member business and legislative recommendations. And we've also have reserved a little time for public input, should there be any. So we'll go right ahead into the agenda with Coastal Master Plan briefing and update from Rear Admiral Ann Phillips.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Lewis, and members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to speak with all of you today and to update you following a presentation that you received on the 4th of October, your last meeting, on the topic of the Virginia Coastal Resilience Master Plan. As I get started this morning, I would like to first introduce my new Sea Grant Fellow, Ms. Lydia Beeline is how you pronounce her last name, is here. Lydia has just completed and defended her dissertation at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. So she will be working in the Office of the Secretary for the next year on the subject of coastal resilience and also working with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, specifically on the master plan and as we move forward with this effort. Also joining me today is Mr. Matt Jones, who is a Virginia Management Fellow. And as always, I would like to thank the staff in DCR, Mr. Matt Dallin and Mr. Connor Winstead, who are the program manager and program coordinator for this work, without whom much would not happen. So moving forward in this context, as an update of what we have done since the 4th of October, we are working towards the document being published. It is currently under review in the Governor's Office of Policy. We are also putting together a web application that will be available to the public and hosted through the Department of Conservation and Recreation's website. The Department of Conservation and Recreation is where the master plan will ultimately reside, under the direction of Mr. Darrell Glover, who is here and who you will hear from momentarily on the Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund. Specifically, we have evaluated our coastal flood hazard. We have conducted an impact assessment and looked at areas that are most impacted, including considering social and economic vulnerability in that context. We have developed a project database collecting projects from across coastal planning districts and regional commissions, and we know we have more work to do there. And we have put together a financial and funding sources, financial opportunities and funding sources database that localities may use, and that is matched to specific projects that we currently have in the project database. In addition, since our last meeting, we've completed 6 additional community outreach sessions, largely in Hampton Roads, but also including some work in the George Washington Regional Commission area in Dahlgren and Aquia Harbor. Those works can continue. We have additional contract capacity to do that work through the coming year. And we know that is absolutely essential work to develop and sustain a public planning process. I mentioned the TAC had met the 7th of October after our last meeting. They also met this past Friday, the 19th of November, and put together their version of a summary of recommendations they may wish to put forward as a separate body. I should add that with the work of the Technical Advisory Committee and the subcommittees, the 7 subcommittees from that committee, has been absolutely critical to us being able to move this forward. They have provided advice, counsel, perspective, public input all along throughout the process, from the perspective of planning districts and regional commissions who are representing, in some cases, localities, but also from the academic perspective, from this perspective of agencies and other federal stakeholders and many other nonprofit and other partners. So absolutely critical that this work is overseen by that kind of a body, and the work of the TAC should continue, as should the work of the master planning process across coastal Virginia. I mentioned that the document is under review and policy. It is, and we hope that we will be able to release and plan to release this document sometime in the coming month, December 2021. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my update this morning, subject to your questions, sir.
All right, thank you very much. Do we have any questions for Rear Admiral Phillips? Anybody down that way? Anybody down there? So let me ask you, Ann, you said that the TAC is actually going to come out with a list of its own recommendations?
Should they choose to do so. They are working in that direction.
They're
sir.
working in
Yes,
that direction,
yes.
okay. But no anticipated timeline about when they might have those out there, or?
Well, I believe that their intent is that they will have these recommendations prepared such that they may be considered by external bodies who might want to think about the work that the TAC has done and what their perspectives are on that work and how it should move forward.
Okay, good. All right, any other questions for Ann?
I have a comment.
Oh, Chris, go ahead.
So for those of you that don't know, this is probably the last time that we will see Admiral Phillips. She's actually been nominated to head up the Maritime Administration and will be heading to Washington, D.C. to represent us. So I want to thank her personally for all the work that she has done on this. Without Admiral Phillips, I'm not sure we would have a coastal adaptation master plan, quite frankly. And I would wish that this body would take seriously the recommendations of the Technical Advisory Committee, because I think it's important to continuing the effort, that group has spent this last year. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I would add, there are a number of stakeholders who have contributed tremendously to this work, and that it is the work of those people and the people I've named when I introduced everyone who have pushed this forward. So what we have mostly learned is the need to continue the work, and I'm honored to have been a part of it. And should I have the honor to be confirmed, I will be honored to take on a new opportunity as well.
Yeah, I want to add my thanks to Chris's as well, Ann, because you've done a yeoman's job at times with very limited resources with a very large portfolio to handle, and you've done an excellent job. And as you know, obviously this started out, Senator Stolley and I had a bill to make it a cabinet level position and became a special advisor, and without the resources of a cabinet level, but you've certainly done, as I said, a great job. So we appreciate your service, and I'm sure you'll carry that same quality of service and dedication to Washington when you go. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Senator.
All right. Understand also that Senator Locke is with us in the virtual room, so welcome, Senator Locke. With that, we'll move on to item number 3 on the agenda with DCR and Darrell Glover on the Community Flood Preparedness Fund update.
Good morning. Excuse me. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I do have a presentation that's been submitted. Give it a second to bring that up. Okay. Thank you. Just to give you an update about the Virginia Community Flood Preparedness Fund, where we are as of today. Next slide, please. Okay. As you know, this program was established by legislation of the 2020 General Assembly to provide support for regions and localities to reduce the impacts of recurrent floodings from all sources, not just coastal sources, and to incentivize communities to complete vulnerability assessments and develop and implement plans to address flooding and to improve resilience. A particular note, since a question or two has come up from an applicant or two along the way, I want to point out section 10.1-603.25 subsection E, which states that no less than 25% of the monies dispersed from the fund each year shall be used for projects in low-income geographic areas. But further, that priority shall be given to projects that implement community-scale hazard mitigation activities that use nature-based solutions to reduce flood risk. There has been a question raised by an applicant or two regarding whether or not an individual property can apply for a community flood preparedness fund. They can. However, it's important to understand that any individual property or paired properties are not going to compete favorably with community scale projects for which the legislation clearly prioritizes for this funding. Next, please. The fund is funded by the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or the RGGI, as it's more commonly known. These are funds that come from basically air pollution facilities that are buying credits, and then those credits are redistributed for various purposes, including flood resilience. Next, please. So 50% of the funds that come from the RGGI auctions go to the Department of Housing and Community Development for low-income energy efficiency programs. There's also a small percentage for administrative expenses, either for housing and community development or the Department of Environmental Quality, which has the overall administrative responsibilities. And then 45% comes to the Department of Conservation and Recreation for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund. What I would point out is that there is no percentage in the legislation for the administrative expenses that DCR incurs, or for the expenses that Admiral Phillips and her team have incurred for the coastal plan. And so those administrative expenses have to be taken from that 45% that come through DCR. Next, please. So to date, there have been 3 RGGI auctions, March 3rd, which resulted in $19.5 million for the Community Flood Preparedness Fund, June 2nd, which resulted in $20.4 million, and then most recently, September 3rd, which resulted in $23.7 million. There will be another auction on December 1st, and that will be the last of the year. And again, of note is that administrative expenses for DCR or for the governor's office for the coastal plan have to be deducted from those amounts that come through the flood fund. Next, please. Here is the schedule as to where we are and where we project to be over the next several months. Round 2 of accepting applications for the flood fund closed on November the 5th. Those applications are still under review. On 12/6, we're going to be releasing the manual for the 3rd round of Community Flood Preparedness Fund applications. On the 17th of December, we anticipate announcing both the 2nd round grant winners and also some additional 1st round grant winners, because we allowed those who were not approved in the 1st round to amend their applications and resubmit them, and I'll speak more to that in a minute. The 3rd round of grant funds will run from January the 6th, 22, for 90 days through April the 8th. And then around about June 17th of 22, we will announce the 3rd round of grant awards. Next, please. So I'm going to break down the applications we've received in several different ways based upon the questions that I was asked when I presented to you at your October 4th meeting. In round 1, which closed on September the 4th, we had 32 applications requesting $16 million from the flood fund versus $17 million that was made available. On October the 5th, Governor Northam announced awards for 19 projects that totaled $7.8 million. Since that time, we have received amendments to 5 round 1 applications that were resubmitted by the November 5th deadline for round 2 applications. You'll note that that does not quite add up to 32 total projects, total applications. We have not denied any applications to date. However, for those that were not resubmitted, there are a number have been withdrawn for a couple of reasons. One is that a number of them were to fund existing staff or to supplement staff that are already funded by localities or other organizations, and that is not allowed. For the capacity building portion of this fund, it is for adding additional staff, not for funding staff that are already on board through other funding sources. Likewise, there have been some that have been withdrawn because some projects that localities had on the board and that were already funded through other means, they attempted to supplant that funding with flood fund funding, and that also is not allowed. For round two, which just closed on November the 5th, we received a total of 37 applications requesting $28.1 million in flood funds versus $18 million that was made available for that round. So what we intend to do, to the extent possible, is that we will use any remaining round one unobligated funds to help meet the round two funding obligations to the extent possible. Next, please. So now I'm going to break this down in various ways. So through round one and round two of the flood fund applications, there have been a total of 69 received, 25 for planning and capacity building. And again, that capacity building is for adding additional staff to what localities and other organizations already have. 29 have been for flood prevention and protection projects for those applicants who have had a pre-approved resilience plan. I'll talk about that later as well. And then 15 have been for studies. Next, please. Looking at it another way, most of the applications have come from coastal communities, which would be expected at this point, but that will change over time. However, 9 of the 69 have come from applications from inland localities, as far west as Buchanan County. Next, please. So this is a breakdown of the types of the authors of these applications. 44 of the 69 have come from cities and counties. 5 have come from incorporated towns. 19 from planning district commissions, and then there's been one other which came from the Hampton Roads Service District. Next, please. For the resilience plans, they have to be pre-approved by the department before project funding can be awarded. And that's a locally based plan based upon flood control and resilience that incorporates nature-based solutions to the maximum extent possible. Item number 3 is most important here, is that it needs to include considerations of all parts of a locality, regardless of socioeconomics or race. It coordinates with other local and interjurisdictional projects, plans, and activities, and has a clearly articulated timeline and phasing for implementation. And of course, it's based on best available science, which includes sea level rise, climate change, storm surge where applicable, and current floodplain maps. Next, please. To date, we have only received 8, we've only approved 8 resilience plans. We have received 9, 2 from PDCs, 1 from a county, 5 from cities, and we have 1 plan pending from an additional city. But all of those projects that you saw listed have come from those who have submitted those 8, been approved for those 8 resilience plans. And I believe that's my last slide, except for the, go ahead and hit the next one, please, except for the contact information for the program. That concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman, subject to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Glover. Any questions for Mr. Glover?
Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman McClellan.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Glover. It's exciting to see us finally spending money on flooding in the state of Virginia, Commonwealth, excuse me. Questions, though, I'm trying to figure out the calculation between the RGGI funds that are set aside for this fund and those which you state are available. There's a delta of about $4.9 million when you take those 2 first grant rounds. Where's that money going?
That's correct. That goes toward, for example, the Dewberry contractor who has prepared the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. It goes toward all of the, not all, but most of the staff who are working on this, most of the staff in the floodplain program, including the 4 additional floodplain planners that we are now recruiting, and the 2 grant persons who will basically administer the fund day to day. Almost all of them are RGGI funded, so it includes that as well. Plus, we are reserving some funding because per code, we have to go beyond the coastal plan, and we have to do a flood protection plan for the entire state. And so we are reserving funds now, and we will be bidding out that work in the coming year in order to continue planning for flood resilience across the remainder of Virginia.
So just a follow-up question, if I may.
Yes, sir. Thanks, ma'am.
The 3% that's set aside for DEQ to administer the RGGI funds, is in addition to the $4.9 million?
Yes, that's DEQ's statutory set aside. Again, all administrative expenses that DCR or the governor's office incurs have to come out of the 45% for the flood fund specifically.
Great. And then who's the, what is the process for reviewing these grants? Who's the final arbiter of who receives grants and who doesn't?
The grants are reviewed first by the floodplain program staff at DCR. It is then elevated to myself and Director Clyde Chrisman, and then we take staff recommendations to the Secretary of Natural and Historic Resources for their concurrence, and then it goes on to the governor's office for their concurrence.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask if there was any feedback based on the implementation that has already been done, if there's any feedback for improvement or things that we need to be looking at and thinking about moving forward to ease the program, if that makes sense.
Well, there has certainly been, just through the experience with any new program, of course, as you get started and you gain experience, you find things that you need to tweak and change. And we have experienced, particularly over issues regarding, what qualifies as low income, for example, and what qualifies as community scale project, which the statute requires. Those two areas in particular, we have seen the need to further clarify. And what we plan to do is we plan to release a considerable amendment to the grant guidance for round 4. And we will, of course, put that out for appropriate public comment period.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Fowler.
So is there anything on our end, on the legislative side, that we should be looking at? I mean, I can think of a few things. I just wanted to get feedback first. So is there anything on our end that we should be thinking about, or is it simply in-house things that need to be tweaked and you guys are working on over there?
Well, if you're referring to legislation that's been rumored or proposed, the administration has not taken any position on potential legislation. Therefore, I have no official opinion. But I will say that I would ask the committee to keep in mind that we already have a dam safety program and a floodplain program, which administers the National Flood Insurance Program for the Commonwealth. Those two are linked at DCR, and the Soil Water Conservation Board, which is not just agriculture, oversees those programs. So I would just suggest that, before any changes are made, that you consider that linkage and how those dovetail together. Because as we move away from the coast, flood control dam structural integrity and the work that needs to be done, the considerable work that needs to be done to improve our flood control dams across the state, that will have a lot to do with flood resilience in the inland portion of Virginia. And over the past year and a half, we have discovered over 1,400 dams that have never been registered and therefore are not in compliance with state code or the regulations, the dam safety regulations. We are beginning to contact those dam owners now. At least 400 of them are high hazard dams, meaning that if they breach, that both human life and significant infrastructure are at imminent risk. So once you get away from the coastline, dam safety has everything to do with flood resilience, and I would just ask the committee to keep that in mind.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
That brings me to a question that I had. Delegate Fowler's question brought up community scale. I mean, what is the current understanding of what community scale projects, mitigation projects are?
Well, Senator, what we are looking at is what it does not mean. Maybe that's a better way to explain this. What it does not mean is a single residence or two neighboring residents. That is not a community. And one thing that concerns us from what we have seen, from some of what we've seen, and not a lot of it, to be honest, is that high dollar properties are being proposed for protection, but truly low income areas are being omitted. And that is not the intent of the legislation or this program.
But you said two neighbors coming together for a project, but several neighbors coming together for, I mean, it's not precluded for them to,
It is not.
okay.
But they will not compete favorably to truly community-scale projects that we receive.
Just ask a question.
Yeah, Delegate Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned high-value properties and then low income on the other extreme. And those actually, in our neck of the woods, go hand in hand, where we have generations of folks that have owned properties, and because of waterfront land and the way it's assessed, it may be considered high value, but, they struggle paying the taxes and they want to protect their property and, with flood mitigation and so forth. So I just want to make sure there's not a disconnect when we make those decisions.
Delegate, there is not, but what I would say in response to that is that there are many low-income properties neighboring those waterfront properties that could very easily be included in the projects that are being proposed.
Mr. Glover, let me ask you also on a separate matter, but you mentioned earlier about, when you were talking about the program at the state level, about the overhead costs and the administrative costs. What about when they make these applications? I mean, are they allowed, are applicants allowed to build in any kind of overhead or any kind of costs that they would incur in administration or of the project?
Well, sir, they can apply for a capacity building grant and augment their existing staff to help run this program at the local level. That is allowable. You're not restricted, no applicant is restricted only applying for one category or another of the three that are available to them. And we have seen, per the presentation, we have seen a number of capacity building grants. A number of localities are doing that before they submit projects because they want to build up some staff to work on this more specifically and then submit a resilience plan and then apply for projects, which is a good way to go.
Okay. No. Delegate Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a relevant question where this would work into my community. So my community, I live in an HOA with 308 homes. So my question would be, I discovered a huge sinkhole in our common area. And upon a few months, we found the city brought out some independent contractors and found, they were clogged with sediment 3/4 of the way, these 5-foot pipes that are under our community that lead these interconnected ponds. And I know I'm getting into the weeds. But would this type of program apply to a community of a 308, let's say the HOA came together and said, we need help. We can't even afford to clean up the banks where the trees are growing into, I think we have 4 or 5 stormwater retention ponds. Would something like that work? Because the whole, and I'm not saying for my community necessarily, it was just an example, but overall, this is a huge problem, especially I know in Virginia Beach where we have 2,000 ponds with only 1,000 with maintenance agreements around them. So would this apply to something like that where the locality could even go in and say, we need help fixing this problem that really kind of built upon, a couple decades of time and things just weren't put in place properly, I guess would be my question, long question.
Delegate, anything that's causing recurrent flooding, including stormwater, can apply to the fund.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Councilwoman McClellan.
I'm glad to see that we're thinking about this beyond coastal flooding. And I noticed of the applications, I believe 9 came from non-coastal communities. Are we doing enough to publicize this throughout the entire Commonwealth? Because we all know that in Southwest Virginia, Central Virginia, South Side, Alexandria, Chesterfield, this is happening everywhere. What are we doing to get the word out about this fund?
Well, one thing that we're going to do, particularly as soon as we get these additional staff hired that are being advertised right now, we're going to align ourselves with the Department of Emergency Management and their respective regions, the way that they divide up Virginia, and we're going to assign staff to each of those regions of the state. And then we can begin to more specifically target areas to raise public awareness about the fund.
Oh, Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Glover, I was just curious, what kind of follow-up does DCR do after a grant is awarded to an applicant? In other words, What are you doing to reinsure the Commonwealth that the funds are being spent, what the applicant said they were going to do? And then also, if it was a project, not a capacity building project, but a project that was supposed to mitigate flooding, if the project was actually effective in mitigating the flooding that the applicant said it was going to do?
Well, given that none of those projects have actually started yet, Mr. Stone, again, as we are able to assign the additional staff that we're trying to hire now to specific regions, we will have the better ability to follow up. I mean, there are time limits within the guidance as to when a project must start once it's been awarded, and we will be following up. And there will be, of course, there will be reporting as there is with any type of grant from the applicant, from the awardee.
Dr. Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For particular projects, whether they're individual or regional, and say it's administered, the grant is, administered at that local level by someone, does the grant help to offset those costs to administer the grant at the local level?
If that applicant is applying for capacity building to add additional staff to administer this, then yes. What the fund is not allowed to do is to supplant existing staff who are already funded through other means.
So just follow up, and you say funded for other means, so, if there's a cost for that staff, guess I'm saying, what do you mean by other means? Let me ask that question.
What I mean is, let's say a given locality has 4 public works staff. They're already existing, they're already part of that locality's budget. The flood fund cannot supplant that funding for those positions. However, if that locality wants to add 2 staff, then the flood fund can fund those new positions.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else? All right, thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, next up, we're going to hear item 4 on the agenda, which is the flood protection program from the City of Virginia Beach. L.J. Hansen. Welcome.
Good morning, and thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee, for allowing me to come today and talk with you about what Virginia Beach is doing to address recurrent flooding. I'm sure everybody on the subcommittee is aware of Virginia Beach's location and the impacts that we have on a sunny day. The wind blows just right, we have a flooding problem, and it's not a secret, and I know everybody here is aware of that. The question is, well, how do we deal with it? And of course, as we look at the other elements that are coming down the pipe with sea level rise, increased threat due to more intense storms, it has been an item that has weighed on City Council's mind. And as they look ahead, obviously, how do they address something that could be in the multi-billion-dollar range? For a locality, that's a scary number, even a locality like the City of Virginia Beach. Myself, I am the Director of Public Works for Virginia Beach. I've only been with Virginia Beach for about 7 months now. So at the point where I was hired, we had a lot of discussions about this. I came from Suffolk before that. And so while our issues in Suffolk we were still a low-lying flat community, it's a little bit different, but I do come from a water background. And so I think that I brought a lot to the table. And as we reason through and ration through how we deal with this effort moving forward, one thing became apparent is that we needed to have a good strategy for how to fund this program moving forward and what that program actually entailed. The city has worked on stormwater as an issue for a number of years, but with the hitting of Hurricane Matthew in 2016 and Julia just before that, that was a real wake-up. And I know that we have members that are from Virginia Beach on the subcommittee, but that really got City Council's attention. And we went from a period where City Council paid significant attention to stormwater to a period where we're investing about 23% of our capital improvement program towards the stormwater flooding projects. In large part, though, that has been funded through the stormwater utility, or the ERU as we oftentimes call it. As we look at that $2 billion, $3 billion number is just not sustainable through the stormwater program. It is not, a stormwater fund and the ERU rate is not going to generate the type of revenue needed to deal with that. Certainly not in a time frame that allows us to address it in any type of a short-term measure. So with all of that in mind, City Council asked us to develop a strategy to allow us to come back with a different type of a funding mechanism that would allow us to use general obligation bonds. At the request of City Council, staff presented a financing plan to substantially advance a phased approach to addressing flood mitigation projects. And part of that funding schedule was based on a desire to separate and conquer, in other words. So as we look at flooding issues in Virginia Beach, we recognize that we have infrastructure that is undersized because it was designed for a different era and designed to address storms that are not as severe as what we see today. So we have maintenance issues, we have underserving infrastructure that's in place today, and then we know that we are trying to address ways to increase the capacity of what we currently have, and then also looking long-term at sea level rise. So rolling all of that together, what we thought made the most sense to us was to preserve the stormwater utility as it currently exists using the ERU, and use the stormwater utility to continue to address issues of maintenance, small capital projects that are related to existing infrastructure, and then to deal with our regulatory component, which all localities have to deal with, our MS4 program. But to address new capacity, we hope to find other means of funding. One of those was the referendum project that allowed us to advance 21 projects in over a 10-year period. Our estimates were, in order to build those 21 projects, utilizing the stormwater utility would take in excess of 40 years. City Council asked us to put together a funding program that would allow us to do it in 10 years. As a result, we came up with a $567.5 million ask to the voters of Virginia Beach in the form of a bond referendum. And we needed to bring that to public referendum because the city charter only allows City Council to authorize general obligation debt in excess of $10 million or to the amount of $10 million in excess of the previous year's retired debt. And for your records, we retire about $65 million a year. So $75 million a year would have been the maximum amount that City Council would have been able to authorize, understanding that, of course, $65 million of that is probably spent on things like fire trucks, schools, and all types of other things. So for those reasons, it was required to put it to a bond referendum. I do have a video that I brought along, if the chairman would allow. It's about 8 minutes long. Talks a little bit. This was a video that was put together that was presented to the citizens of Virginia Beach as an educational component. Of course, staff could take no position whether for or against the referendum. The video was intended only to educate, and I have a few more comments afterwards, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Really quickly, just out of curiosity, because I think it was, what, a 72% vote? Was that what it was, or something?
I believe it's 78-22.
Incredible. Did anybody run any kind of a campaign to promote the referendum, or the bond issue, or?
There was not an organized campaign either for or against. I do know that there were several members of the community that came out and spoke. Certainly members of City Council came out and spoke at a number of meetings. City Council or city staff were involved in a number of education meetings. Again, not advocating, only educating on what the elements were that were in the bond referendum.
Mr. Chair.
It was Councilwoman McClellan.
So it was my understanding there were actually political yard signs in promotion of this throughout the city of Virginia Beach. Somebody was organizing it and did a damn good job. So kudos, by the way. But I'm just curious where that came from.
Yes, ma'am. There was a funded effort to educate. None of our signs were put out to, the words vote yes or vote no were clearly omitted. City Council had asked us to prepare educational materials and make that educational material available to the taxpayers. That was our effort. So we very much tried to be right in the middle, making sure that everybody had the information that they needed to determine for themselves how they wish to vote on the referendum.
Okay.
We had some magnets that we put on our trucks that directed you to our website, and we had some yard signs that directed you to the website. But again, no push one way or the other.
Okay, all right, okay, go ahead with your video.
All right, thank you.
Virginia's largest city by population is battling a chronic water crisis. Not too little water, like some places, but too much. Virginia Beach faces the greatest risk for major flooding of any metro area on the East Coast because of more frequent and more destructive storms, along with rising sea levels. Existing stormwater infrastructure just can't keep up with it all. The flooding affects everyone citywide, turning Virginia Beach roads into streams, creating dangerous conditions for drivers, sometimes cutting off whole neighborhoods. Even on sunny days, high winds are known to trigger rising water. Small rainstorms often create minor flooding, but bigger storms bring so much water that they damage our homes, cars, and businesses. This recurrent flooding also threatens the health of the Virginia Beach economy. More than 15,000 civilian employees work at military bases here. Millions of tourists flock to our beaches and attractions every year. And major employers like Geico, Centerra, and Steel gravitate here, enjoying the low cost of doing business in Virginia Beach. But they all have one thing in common: a need for passable roads and a community safe from floods. FEMA analysis projects that up to 1 in every 10 buildings in Virginia Beach is currently at risk of damage if a large storm hit today. That number climbs to 1 in 4 when combined with a sea level rise of 1.5 feet. And the damage risk jumps to 2 out of every 3 homes and other buildings if the sea level rises 3 feet. Virginia Beach is tackling flooding head on. The city is already investing more money in stormwater projects than it invests in any other area. City engineers say recently completed projects show significant improvements. To keep ahead of this threat, the City of Virginia Beach wants to accelerate and expand work to address additional flood challenges. A city council authorized referendum on flood protection for voters to consider is on the November ballot. It's an aggressive, multi-generational flood protection program to speed up existing flood and stormwater controls while adding new projects as well. City leaders believe the proposed flood protection program will have a ripple effect that safeguards homes, protects businesses, and responsibly addresses stormwater issues for generations to come. Voters will decide on November 2nd whether the city can issue what's called general obligation bonds for up to $567.5 million. This bond referendum would pay for 21 major projects and other improvements in 6 major areas. They would be built over the next 10 years on a timetable far shorter than current schedules, all to provide Virginia Beach with fiscally sustainable long-term flood protection. The flood protection referendum will allow for existing resources to remain in place and be redirected to focus on stormwater maintenance efforts. The city will also report back to Virginia Beach residents tracking progress, schedules, and budgets. This comprehensive flood protection program is on the ballot in Virginia Beach this November 2nd. Depending on the final terms of the bond issue, property taxes in Virginia Beach will rise between 4.3 and 6.4 cents. This translates into about $10 to $14 more a month for property owners, or about $115 to $171 more in property tax each year. Without these improvements, flooding will be increasingly harder to control, and the fixes will take longer, creating a less desirable ripple effect. The estimated average losses due to stormwater flood hazards in Virginia Beach today are already about $437 million a year, according to a recent study. If the city does nothing, with a 1.5-foot sea level rise, those losses could reach $616 million and grow to $1.66 billion in losses with a sea level rise of 3 feet in Virginia Beach. However, the Flood Protection Program bond referendum aims to minimize the risk of flooding, reduce damage, and better protect the entire Virginia Beach community. Here are projects as listed in Phase 1 of the Flood Protection Program referendum. First, in the Lincoln Bay Drainage Basin, improvements along First Colonial Road and Oceana Boulevard include building a new stormwater management facility to divert stormwater and provide more runoff storage. Improvements in the SeaTac neighborhood include installing or replacing large drainage pipes to collect more runoff. And in the Central Beach District, projects include improvements to the 24th Street culvert, construction of major stormwater collection systems, pump stations, and an ocean outfall system to combat flooding. Next, along Eastern Shore Drive, residents will notice improvements in stormwater collection and a brand new pump station. And at Chubb Lake and Lake Bradford, look for drain and culvert improvements, tide control devices, and new detention ponds, along with new pump stations. In the southern watershed, the plan calls for new floodgates and levees at the West Neck Creek Bridge, a part of the city's sea level-wise adaptation strategy. Also in the works, significant improvements to stormwater, green infrastructure, including a marsh restoration project in Back Bay. The Flood Protection Plan also calls for raising Pungo Ferry Road and improvements to the Sand Bridge, New Bridge intersection. At Windsor Woods, Princess Anne Plaza, and the Lakes, plans call for turning the Bow Creek Golf Course into a park with stormwater storage. A new tide gate, pump station, and tide barriers will be built along London Bridge Creek. A new flood control gate will be constructed along Holland Road at the Lakes, along with new earth and concrete flood barriers in the Lakes and Windsor Woods. The city also plans a new stormwater pump station near Lake Windsor and South Boulevard, and flood control improvements at Thalia Creek and Lake Trashmore. To help you navigate the decision, learn more about the November bond referendum and the Flood Protection Program. Visit www.vbgov.com/ripple effect.
we will be meeting with that committee monthly, giving them updates on where we are on the projects. And I think one of the other things that's going to be very evident is that ripple effect will probably play a very prominent role in most of our projects. You'll start to see signs that say ripple effect. We want folks to know that this money is going to use, it's being put into service the way that they asked us to do so, and in the most effective and efficient means that we can. I do have some flyers here, if you're interested, that talk about the projects themselves. And other than that, I'm available for any questions that you may have.
That's great, and great video. Very well done. And thank you, Mr. Hanson, for on short notice putting this together for us and coming up here, because I think there was a great deal of interest in how you all achieved this success with this referendum and what you were going to do with it. So this has been very informative. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Hanson? Delegate Fowler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Mr. Hanson, for your presentation and all the work you're doing. And I know you just came in 7 months, so you might not have answers to my questions. I apologize.
I heard your previous comment, and I was like, oh, no, she's going to ask me about her neighborhood and her
No, I'm not going to ask you about my neighborhood. But I am going to ask, Mr. Chair, I'm going to ask about kind of about accountability and building standards. I have found that HOAs, and I'm in real estate as well, I'm a broker, so I do know a lot about HOAs. And common interest communities in general, and they've been kind of used as a mechanism, as like kind of a loophole. So now we find ourselves, and I don't know where the current number is, but I know we had about 2,000 stormwater maintenance facilities, those ponds, and only about 1,000 of them in Virginia Beach, and only about 1,000 had maintenance agreements on them. So what I found in my neighborhood is there's nobody in charge. And this is just an example. I don't need my neighborhood anything to do with that. But there's nobody in charge of that maintenance of the ponds, but the city is in charge of dredging them when they need it. But it gets so bad that it needs dredging because there's no one really responsible for the outside maintenance of the sediment buildup. So let's see, it was built in mid-90s. So you got several decades that go by, and now we realize there is a lot going on, and there's sediment filling pipes. And if you take the other example of Asheville Park, where we've spent millions fixing that, is there anything in the plan, or is there anything in the works that would address, oversight in planning and building and just inspecting? I've been in neighborhoods in my district where private maintenance agreements got put in for 4 houses, and then we dig up and we see that it's not working because it wasn't put in properly, and there is no accountability in the inspections and who signed off on it. So I guess I'm just asking if that is part of it. I see a lot of old infrastructure. We're addressing that, but what about future Buckner Farms, neighborhoods in our area that have made the news with their flooding issues? I guess that's a really broad question, but it's an issue that I would love to see what we're doing with that, Mr.
Well, I would say it's not part of the referendum in and of itself. The referendum is really addressing flood capacity issues. That's the part that we were trying to address with the referendum. Having said that, all of our flooding concerns are intertwined. You've touched on a number of really difficult and or delicate issues with us as it relates to BMP maintenance and actually accountability for that maintenance. We have historic BMPs that maybe were built that didn't have a water quality component, so that means they would have been some time ago, and we're using them to control flooding, but there's no accountability again to make sure that they're being maintained in any capacity. That represents a challenge for us. Normally, how we deal with that is we try to work with the homeowner, and we try to, or the property owner, I should say, and as things develop in the future, or as somebody else comes in and wishes to use that facility to do something else with, an adjoining property wants to use that, and we try and address it through those means. We have a number of facilities where you have multiple houses that own the pond. That is problematic. We have a number of just single-family residences where they bought a house and didn't realize that they had a facility on it. That's problematic. We work through all of these issues, but they all have different answers, and they all have different issues. Most of that we're trying to address either through local, or on occasion we work through our Hampton Roads PDC to try and work on state legislation to authorize us to do something that we don't otherwise have the ability to do.
Mr. Chair, follow up. So would that, we're kind of creating the same problem that's going to keep happening as we build more neighborhoods that don't necessarily, is there anything actively in place now that prevents this from happening? There's a lot of building going on and things in neighborhoods. So is there anything that prevents that from happening? Again, lack of maintenance agreements, maybe that would be a good way to put it.
My apologies, I should have been clear. For new development, we're actually very good at that. It's not the new development, one or two examples aside, it's not new development that causes us the greatest issues. It's the historic development that causes us the greatest issues. But moving forward, we're very good about having maintenance agreements in place, easements in place, and other protective means that in the event that somebody is not maintaining it, then the city has the ability to step in, do the maintenance, and back charge against. It's the historic elements that usually tend to cause us the greatest problems. You said your neighborhood, you said mid-90s. Mm-hmm. That predates a lot of the legislation that exists.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, one more follow-up. Would love to follow up more about this in the future to kind of get a handle on it, but it does open up for the committee for consideration in the future what that looks like in other localities. I'm glad Virginia Beach is addressing it and working on it, but this is where it gets us in that trouble and in that problem where you get to a point where you realize half of your locality doesn't have the maintenance agreements to make sure that the sediment doesn't build up. And I know it sounds so boring, but after about 2-3 decades, you're going to have the flooding. So 5-foot pipes full, completely in my neighborhood. So, and that's just one example. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to bring that up so that we could address it in the future, the maintenance agreement issue.
Any other questions? Delegate Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you put all of this together, have you really looked at the economic impact and job creation as you move forward with this?
It's a great question. So ODU was commissioned to do some information, and it's on our website. I apologize, I didn't bring that information with me, but they did put out ODU's economic analysis proved or demonstrated that this was an economic engine for the city, not just a drain on the taxpayers. Certainly in this environment that we find ourselves in with the infrastructure bill, ARPA, and the number of other programs that are out there, everything is a little bit hard to nail down as to actual numbers, but nevertheless, I truly believe that their analysis is true and correct. This is a multi-generational project. We've been pretty clear in our marketing. This is phase 1. There will be a phase 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, all at the will of the then city councils and the citizens at that point. But yes, this will be a driver for our economy moving forward.
Mr. Chair. First of all, great question, Delegate Hodges. I think we need to remember the sort of the blue economy and what comes with that. You mentioned the infrastructure bill. One of the things, the city of Norfolk is very hopeful that we will finally get some massive funding from the Army Corps to deal with our billions of dollars of needs as well. And I'm wondering if the city of Virginia Beach is considering, as part of this bond referendum, the state and local match that will come with that, which is something that we're very excited about the potential of these projects, but very weary about how we are going to be able to afford that 35% state and local match. And we're going to need a lot of help from the Commonwealth for sure. And I don't know, how is Virginia Beach handling that possibility?
I'm glad you asked the question because it's really at the heart of what most of the questions that I received personally as we were educating people on the referendum dealt with that. Well, where's the state? Where's the federal government in all of this? Again, these are 21 projects. By no means is this an exhaustive list. We have way more to go. And this doesn't address sea level rise for the most part. This is our first attempt at trying to tackle some of our substandard infrastructure, some of the pipes that are just too small to carry what we needed to carry. We very much are looking for the state and federal partners to help us continue to move forward. We just recognize that we have stake in this as well. This money was not designated to be our match. This money, as it was calculated, was what we felt we needed to do to accomplish these 21 projects. That's not to say that City Council couldn't change their desire for how they want to participate. I don't believe that they would do so with this money because it It wasn't how the bond referendum was passed, and I don't believe that they treat this money as sacrosanct. They're not going to want to touch this to do something else with it. They're going to want to accomplish the 21 projects, but I do believe that they would still look to find other funding means to help should state or federal money become available.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we'll move on to member business. I know that Mr. Stone has circulated some proposed language amendments. Chris, you want to speak to those?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And not to belabor this, they were included or handed out. There were several items that I thought I would just bring forward for your consideration. A lot of it has to do with the comprehensive plans. There is an amendment that I think is probably overdue for the county, cities, and towns, and for Chapter 22, which is the planning and subdivision and land zoning, which includes making sure that we incorporate sea level rise and climate change in the comprehensive plans. Right now, the way it's currently written is it only applies to HRPDC, but it really should apply to all those cities and towns that are included in the definition of tidewater, which takes it all the way up to the city of Alexandria. The other is an addition, which is what the comprehensive plan should include. It's always been interesting to me that the definition of resiliency does not appear in the Code of Virginia anywhere. So we throw that term out loosely, but it really needs to be defined. And how each one of those localities, as they're doing their comprehensive plans, how they apply resiliency and how they measure it. And then the last one really is a follow-on to, I think, House Bill 2071, which Delegate Converse Fowler was able to get through last year. But essentially, having resiliency be a part of Smart Scale. And I know that there was some objection from the Northern Virginia delegation because they felt like Hampton Roads was going to be able to score higher because of that. However, if you look at where some of the major flooding is in the Commonwealth, actually the city of Alexandria is hit really, really hard. So it's one of those things where it could be applied, I think, in a very meaningful way across the Commonwealth, and it's something that we really should be including in our Smart Scale.
Anybody have any comments on Delegate Hodges?
Just have a comment. When we look at this, of course, going like a smart scale is going to lean it towards more to the urban areas. And as we have discussions, it seems like more and more things are geared towards the urban areas. And I understand that, where you try to get your most bang for the buck for the most people, but you're leaving huge areas of the Commonwealth without assistance and without help. And rural areas need help too, and should not be left out. And we need to ensure that we help to try to find tools in these localities to be able to assist with that. We have some of the poorest areas in the Commonwealth of Virginia. But when you look at those regions, because you have waterfront property, they're often penalized because those waterfront properties are, of course, a higher value, but you also have areas where 75% of the folks that live and work there drive out of those areas to work, leaving behind a workforce that has the lowest wages in the state, and are often those property owners and need assistance. So I think we need to be cautious as we move forward and trying to make any major changes.
I mean, Delegate Hodges, I certainly agree. Smart Scale for the western part of the Commonwealth, for example, scores higher when you have a project that brings economic development. Whereas if you've got an urban area, Smart Scale may say if you're relieving congestion, you get a little bit higher score. So it's not the same metric that's applied everywhere across the Commonwealth. And all I think that we should be looking at is resiliency needs to be a factor somewhere along that line in Smart Scale. Certainly, it's not going to be equally weighted across the Commonwealth, but it needs to be a factor.
Doug Akeem.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Stone, for bringing this in. I think it's a really good idea to start the conversation. As to the exact language, obviously, we'll have to double check and triple check. Just first question is, could you clarify once again expansion when you use the words Tidewater, Virginia as defined by Code Title 62 versus Hampton Roads, how many more jurisdictions does that include?
I don't know exactly. There's probably some of the PDC members here that might have that information.
But you did mention it goes up to Northern Virginia.
It goes up to Northern Virginia.
Okay. So that obviously makes sense in terms of expanding the footprint. And Mr. Chair, just another couple of follow-ups. The definition of resiliency that you use in your proposed Title 15, where is that language from?
Actually, it's one that's been circulated through the engineering community, specifically the American Society of Civil Engineers. There is also a definition of resiliency. Interestingly enough, the only organization, I think, state organization, transportation organization, VDOT specifically, has introduced some considerations for climate change and coastal storms, and it's in Chapter 33, but it only applies to structures and bridge. And they have a definition of resiliency as well. I think coming up with the definition that I think everyone agrees on, I think is something that would be beneficial going forward.
Mr. Chair, I don't remember when we passed the bill back on the Chief Resiliency Officer and other aspects of what we've done here, but have we not defined resiliency before? I just assumed we did, maybe.
There are
maybe
several places where it occurs and it says it applies to this section only, but resiliency is used throughout. It's crept into the code, but there's no overall definition of resiliency.
So, and then just final point on that, because I did notice that, to your point, Mr. Stone, that for Title 15, you've got one language for resiliency defined, and for the Title 33, you have a different resiliency definition, that obviously being on the transportation side. But it may make some sense to have just a standalone bill that actually defines resiliency in a way that's comprehensive as well as narrowly tailored, so that we don't end up having 4 or 5 different definitions, especially in these bills. And then just a final comment on this, and I don't know how the Senate's going to be dealing with it, and especially in terms of bill numbers and such, bill limits, but my guess is that this will have to be split into 2 bills, because you've got the zoning section and then you got a transportation section. So, I mean, obviously the experts will deal with that at some point, but it may help if we're going to have some kind of a comprehensive bill that looks at resiliency to add a third bill that would be a definition of resiliency in some appropriate part of the code, so that we can refer back to that. So I think from a drafting perspective, we can have those conversations, but generally speaking, I think it's a good place to start, and I share some of the concerns from my colleague, Delegate Hodges, but I think the reality is the urban-rural split, the urban-rural equity issues are going to come up in many, many aspects of our policymaking, not just in this context, but in so many other formulas, especially in terms of education and transportation funding generally. So I think I would hate for us to not do something here when we're trying to do something proactively for the purposes of adding proactive thinking and having considerations being made early in the process, and not end up having that become a problem for equity purposes of urban rural, so that we don't end up doing something that is really needed for the urban area. So I'd like to be able to hope that we have a more comprehensive way of looking at this. So I wouldn't be as concerned about that factor, but I do recognize that is clearly a concern that we should be addressing across all policymaking. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Anybody else? Delegate Fowler.
Mr. Chair, so where does, and I know this is a conversation for the group, but where do we feel like infrastructure fits on this kind of spectrum of what we're dealing with flooding? In my district, most of the flooding is a byproduct of climate change or sea level rise. And what we're seeing is we wouldn't see as much of the flooding if it wasn't for the poor infrastructure. So I know we're dealing with it kind of patchwork where localities are dealing with it, but moving forward to ensure that the neighborhoods being built, the development that we're putting in has backups in place. There's no one that is supposed to maintain a lot of the banks around these ponds that have trees and they really put a lot of sediment and break pipes. So that's a lot of what I'm seeing in my district. So I'm just wondering, and I think that would address a lot for rural, for urban, for any locality, and it would address the problem across the Commonwealth. So I'm just wondering where that would fit in and if anybody has any other thoughts on it.
Anybody? We're thoughtless. Chris, let me go back to.
Go ahead,
Mr.
Chair, I guess I don't know if this is where you were headed. But one of the challenges in the engineering community, and I think this is where the City of Virginia Beach has addressed this, they have actually come out with increased guidelines for engineering design when it comes to stormwater, for example, and increased precipitation by 20% over, so, and the reason why they did that is because if you don't, you put in a system that is under design the minute it goes into service. Kudos to the City of Virginia Beach for doing that. A lot of other localities have not done that. The state has not done that, quite frankly. The country hasn't done that yet. And we're still we're playing catch up. I don't know that it's the purview of the state to actually do what the City of Virginia Beach has done and come out with increased design guidelines so that we don't do that, but it certainly is needed. And it's really critical with this infrastructure bill that's just being passed because there's going to be a tremendous amount of influx of money into the Commonwealth to deal with a lot of these issues. And if we don't have those current design guidelines, we're going to be right back to where we started.
Doug Hodges.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the concerns, but in our area, in rural areas, we do have some problems with pipes and drains, but primarily it's Mother Nature. And a big problem that we have also is ditches, and the roadside ditches are a tremendous issue. VDOT only maintains the ditches and so far on each side. And years ago, farmers maintained these outfall ditches, many of them on their properties. That's gone away now. And these outfall ditches, the state would even come in and say, I'm going to fix this ditch, and it's on private property. So now it's a private property issue, and the state cannot step on any of these outfall ditches. So that's our biggest problem, trying to overcome the challenges with the state maintaining just the sides of the roads, and you can only dig those ditches so deep, and the water has nowhere to go. And we're dealing with colonial infrastructure that was put in hundreds of years ago to drain these roads, because many of these roads were built 100, 200 years ago. And I've tried to do some things to address that, and that's a tremendous problem. But then on the shore, most of it's just Mother Nature that we're dealing with, and where we live.
Chris, going back to your point about incorporating resiliency into the smart scale scoring, I actually had a bill that did that in last year in the General Assembly, and so obviously I think it has merit. But along the lines of what Delegate Keem and Delegate Hodges said, there on the Senate side anyway, there was a lot of headwinds with the way the bill was worded. So we ratcheted it back, but I think the end result, which passed, still made some important strides in getting resiliency as part of the discussion when you're talking about Commonwealth transportation projects at the Commonwealth Transportation Board level and at the Commissioner VDOT level. So, but again, it is certainly a meritorious idea, but not without some political problems. So, anybody else? Councilwoman McClellan.
Is this the time to talk about legislation? I'm assuming.
You are right on cue, because we're moving on to number 6, legislative recommendations. Oh, actually, but I had you under member business, so you're in the right place anyway, so go ahead.
So as a member, as well as the chair of the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission, we have, as an organization, our 17 municipalities have unanimously supported our legislative package, which includes the creation of a Commonwealth Flood Board, legislation which you've previously carried. And we've done some, I would say the staff, which is great. I wanted to recognize Ben McFarland and Whitney Kaczmarek, who are here today, have gone through and created proposed legislation that would create not only a Commonwealth Flood Board, but also an Office of Flood Control. I would deem this maybe the Virginia Flood Act. As proposed legislation. One of the things that's driving this is we really feel that there needs to be oversight for these RGGI funds that are coming in, because as pointed out right now, the way the legislation was created, with all due respect to DCR, at this point there is no such oversight. So the Commonwealth Flood Board would take that on along with additional flood monies that we imagine we'll see through infrastructure. The proposal would take 3% of the RGGI funds to create this office, so that it's potentially already funded as well. And it's very well outlined, and you'll receive information in your email. But we're hoping that this can move forward. We see this as a very much a bipartisan or nonpartisan issue, and something that's definitely affecting the entire state, rural as well as urban Virginia, from severe Southwest Bristol to Hampton Roads to Alexandria. And so we'd love to see this get passed this year. We think this is such a huge issue, affecting all of us in many different ways, whether it's dams, ditches, or the sea level rise that we're seeing as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think we've done a pretty good comprehensive perspective of this and would love to have your support.
Any questions on the flood board? All right, well, that's sort of, Chris, go ahead.
Just one quick comment. I attended the Technical Advisory Committee meeting that was on Friday, and one of the recommendations that will be forthcoming out of the TAC is the establishment of a flood board. So it does have the support of the Technical Advisory Committee.
Good. And that sort of segues us into number 6 on our agenda, which is legislative recommendations. And we can approach this in a couple of ways. It has been our habit, I think, or custom, I guess, and I'll defer to Delegate Hodges on this, that we usually try to squeeze in a meeting in early January, the week the Assembly convenes, to actually sort of bless certain legislative initiatives. And so that would be my preference this year as well, because frankly, a lot of these things aren't drafted yet, so it's kind of hard to sign on to something even conceptually without seeing the language. So I think that would be my preference, and if you all have any thoughts on that administratively, we'd like to hear them. Everybody good with doing it that way?
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Councilwoman McClellan.
I have been talking with folks all over the Commonwealth about this issue, and there are folks beyond Hampton Roads who really want to help and assist. And I know we have a lobby day for everything else under the sun, but we don't have a lobby day about flooding. And so I'm wondering, to your point, could we organize with your staff what appropriate day that might look like to come help assist with these bills that your future bills that you're talking about?
Are you talking about a lobby day? Is that what
A
you're
lobby
talking
day
about?
where
Yeah, sure. I
I'm
think that's
happy to
great.
help spearhead that and bring citizens from all over the Commonwealth. We'll wear our galoshes or soggy socks.
Soggy socks. There you go.
But I
Just got Delegate Hodges' vote.
I think I think it's about time, and I think we get a lot of folks who are excited about this. So I'd love to figure out. I don't know how that works, so I'll need some guidance. But I'm happy to
Yeah, no,
spearhead
we'd
that.
be happy to. We'll all coordinate if we can with our staffs and whatever to try and make that a reality. I think that's an excellent idea. But conceptually, going back to the specific legislative recommendations, I mean, some of the things that we're talking about, and we've talked about before, and obviously Chris has hit on 3 of them right here, which are all have great merit. We're also looking at, obviously, the codification of the Technical Advisory Committee going forward. So that's going to be something that is going to be, I think, probably an initiative that will at least be introduced. And I think, Delegate Hodges, you had a sort of administrative thing you were talking about before about the name of the...
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I recall, a few years ago, we did update the resolution to deal with flooding statewide originally when it was created. I believe it was just coastal flooding and storm surge.
Yeah.
And then the resolution was updated maybe 4 or 5 years ago to deal with it statewide and deal with flooding statewide. But in the title, I believe, is still called, it still says coastal flooding, so there's a mismatch. So when we draft the new resolution, if we could probably just remove that.
And Scott, we are up this year, right? Yes, we are due. Okay, to be renewed. Okay, all right.
I guess.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I guess before the pre-file deadline, usually we're bipartisan in carrying that. Usually we have one
absolutely.
from each chamber and each party in each chamber
Right.
to carry that resolution. So we would need to both get that in, if you could do that for us, Jeff, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah, just as we're having an open conversation about the next steps, I think there are a couple, 3 things that we're talking about here. One is, number one, obviously, for people on this side of the dais, we have a deadline that we have to meet in terms of the draft requests, and that's next Monday, at least to get the ball rolling. And so regardless of whether we may or may not support a bill, whether we would carry the bill or not, I think we want to make sure that all the ideas that we've been contemplating for the last year from this commission, if we deem there's some merit, that we ought to have it at least be drafted, whether it's through one of our members' offices or through the staff. I think it'd be great for us to just protect ourselves to having the opportunity to introduce it. So the first is just making sure it's all drafted, and if there's a motion required, I'd be happy to make one, but Mr. Stone's as well as Councilwoman McClellan's ideas, if we want to at least have them drafted just for the purpose of having some language in front of us the next time we meet, I think that would be the first step, is just having that prepared. And, you know, I can volunteer my office if you need, or somebody else to get the ball rolling. Second thing would be, when we have the language and when we are at the stage where we can come together and talk about who is going to introduce the bill or who has committed to doing so, is there merit? Then the question becomes, will this commission as a whole or as an official body endorse that measure versus just saying, we know that there's a bill and any of us can feel free to vote for or against it depending on what your own personal views are. And so that's the meeting that we're just talking about that may happen in January. And that'll help us kind of shepherd which bills will go as part of the commission's agenda, which bills may come out of a conversation that was here, but there's no consensus around that. So if a bill is introduced, nobody should be saying this is a commission bill, because it shouldn't be. And then the third point that the councilwoman mentioned is the lobbying and the advocacy side of it. I think it'd be a great idea to have a flooding day or a flood lobby day. But that I would think would make the most sense to choose on a day when these bills are up for discussion, or at least somewhere close to that day, so that we know which committee to target. So that one, I think it would be a little bit premature for us to pick a date at this stage, but certainly I and whoever else here that will be in session in January, we can all help coordinate that work. So with that, if there's a motion that's required to do any of those discussions, I'd be happy to make one. If not, if we can just kind of at least has a consensus understanding that that's the process, then I don't think we need to take any official action today. But as long as we can make sure that no bill idea that's been generated will be left off the table, I think that's would be my number one concern, is that we have the bill at least drafted.
Yeah, and I can tell you that certainly the flood board is being drafted, as is the TAC, codification of the TAC already. But yeah, I think that's entirely appropriate. I don't think we need any vote or anything on that. I think we can just see to it actually happening. So.
Do we, Mr. Chairman?
Go ahead.
Do we need to vote on whether or not we want to continue doing the good work of the commission and the board?
That one I think we can go ahead and vote on.
So for the resolution?
Yeah. You want to make a motion?
I'll make a motion that we have, that Jeff draft the resolution with the recommended changes.
All right. All right, we have a motion and a second. I don't think we don't need a recorded vote, do we? We do need a recorded vote, I'm told. Okay, open her up.
Delegate Keem.
Aye.
Delegate Askew.
Aye.
Delegate Hodges.
Aye.
Delegate Ranson. Senator Kiggins.
Aye.
Senator Locke.
Aye.
Andrea McClellan.
Aye.
Chris Stone.
Aye.
Joseph Bouchard.
Aye.
Vice Chair Converse Fowler. Mr. Chair.
Aye.
Ayes 10, no 0.
Jeff, you got your work cut out for you. You didn't have anything to do, did you? All right, and obviously we want to address the little sub-issue there of the name when we redo the thing, Jeff, so. Yeah. And you all can look, well, obviously for the public's edification, we'll look at the first week that we are here prior to, we convene on January the 12th. So probably sometime on Monday or Tuesday of that week, we'll have a fairly quick meeting, which may or may not be officially sanctioned, and look over what the actual.
You have the rules chair here. I can let you know.
Oh, no. We've transgressed. So we'll do that and do some quick review of the actual legislative proposals as they're going to appear in the Assembly. And we've also got, as item number 7, public testimony. So is there anybody queued up there, Sean? Or in the audience?
Mr. Chair, at this time, there are 16 members of the public registered to speak virtually, and I sense there is at least one in the room.
All right, let's let them fly. Go ahead.
We'll begin with our in-person speaker.
Chairman,
Hey, Joe.
members of the committee, good to be back in person. Joe Lurch with the Virginia Association of Counties. Just had a chance to review the proposals by Mr. Stone today. I just want to provide some comments in context. It is the first one dealing with taking it beyond the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission. That would include all the Bay Act localities, which I think is roughly about 83. One thing to note was when, Mr. Chairman, when you carried that bill with Senator Miller back in 2015, it was determined that the fiscal impact at that time could be assumed by those entities named. So maybe just needs to be looked at again whether that's a possibility. The interesting thing to note is that it does, at the request of the locality, provide that technical assistance, which we appreciate. In that regard, I think, that's something we would support. In terms of the second bill, that doesn't have that same provision in there. So I think that's something to be looked at. And probably from a broader context, and this goes back to the Chesapeake Bay Act, and I'm old enough to remember when I was a young planner in the city of Fairfax, having to draft the comp plan section of the Chesapeake Bay Act. The state actually had Chesapeake Bay Act funds, grants to localities, and that may be a consideration because there's a lot of technical stuff here. And do agree with Mr. Stone. I mean, having this stuff in place when there might be federal funds available would be critical, but localities are going to need that assistance. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Okay, Sean, who do we have in the queue?
Moving on to our virtual presenters, Mr. Chair, we'll begin with Brad Martin. Elizabeth Andrews will be next. I'm promoting Brad to panelist presently. Mr. Martin, please go ahead and begin your testimony.
I've got no comments. I'm just here as an observer. I appreciate what all of you all are doing. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. All right, next up.
Elizabeth Andrews will be next. Emmett Heltzel will follow. And I want to advise our members of the public, anybody in the Zoom room as an attendee presently will be called on and asked to testify. You are able to watch the meeting through the live stream rather than in the Zoom room if you have no public comment.
Elizabeth?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually didn't sign up to speak, so I appreciate the opportunity. Just glad to be here listening. And if you have questions about the Technical Advisory Committee's recommendations, I'm happy to answer those. As Chris mentioned, that we did have a consensus-driven discussion on Friday about that. And I just wanted to note that we do have a definition of resilience for the EJ Council and State Code, and also one in the Virginia Marine Resources Commission's regulations for their particular program, as Chris noted. But we don't have a broad brush one other than in the Resilience Master Plan framework. So assumedly we'll have one in the final master plan.
Elizabeth, are you still there?
Yes, sir.
Hey, when will the TAC recommendations be out there?
We came to consensus on what they should include on Friday, and we have all of them drafted except for the outreach subcommittee's input is being provided. It was done verbally at the meeting, virtually provided by the outreach subcommittee chair. So that has to be incorporated, and Dr. Carl Hirschner is also incorporating one final bit about a spatial analysis, but other than that, they are ready to go. So I'm not exactly sure when, but I would say in a couple of weeks is probably a good guess. Admiral Phillips may be able to help me out with that more.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, Sean.
Mr. Chair, it looks like Emmett Heltzel hasn't accepted promotion to panelist and may not be at their computer. Jack Wilson, please begin your testimony whenever you're ready. Natalie Snyder, you will be next.
Mr. Wilson? Okay, Ms. Snyder? Oh, everybody's just fleeing. Let's try again. Next up.
Jack Wilson, Natalie Snyder, Shannon Varner, or Wendy Cooper.
Okay. I think folks are just confused and in the Zoom room, but go ahead. Is that all?
Mr. Chair, it seems that there are no remaining members of the public who wish to give testimony, with the exception of Shannon Varner. Shannon, would you like to speak?
No, I didn't have any comments either. I was just listening in. Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chair, at this time, I believe that does conclude our public testimony.
Okay, great. Thank you all, and that was the last item on our agenda. So I will ask if there's any members of the panel have anything to bring to the panel's attention before we adjourn. Chris?
Mr. Chair, I just had one real quick one. The last meeting that we were at, we talked about, there was the VSEM study and the recommendations, and I don't know if there was anyone that was going to do anything with recommendation number 1, because we asked specifically what should come out of that study. And I don't know if anybody's going to do anything with that or not.
Which recommendation number 1?
The recommendation was establish a structure for more effective collaboration and coordination, and it came from the impact on coastal community study that we reviewed at the last meeting. But I know a lot of people were on virtually, and so I'm not sure if there was any action on that or not.
Mr. Chair,
Delegate Fowler.
it was something that my team is looking at. We just haven't finished our conversation. So I just wanted to, I'll swing back around and talk with you about it.
Okay.
But
All right.
in the next couple of days. Thank you.
All right. Anybody else? All right. With that, we'll look forward to seeing each other in January. We are adjourned.